the island of St Helena, May 5th, 1821. The man who once ruled most of Europe is dying inside a small, damp house in the middle of the South Atlantic, a prisoner for the last 6 years of his life. His doctors will write stomach cancer as the cause. For more than a century, that explanation will simply be accepted, filed away, and largely forgotten. Then, in 1961, a Swedish toxicologist gets his hands on a preserved lock of the dead emperor's hair, submits it to a laboratory technique that didn't exist in 1821, and finds something nobody in that sick room 2 centuries earlier could possibly have suspected. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte's final years, one of history's longest-running medical mysteries, and a decorating trend so popular across 19th century Europe that it may have quietly poisoned the man who once conquered most of the continent. A quick warning before we go further: this one is genuinely unsettling, and every word of it is true, including the part where the exact same toxic compound found in Napoleon's hair was, at the height of its popularity, painted onto the walls of countless ordinary Victorian homes, entirely legally, for decades after his death. After his final defeat at Waterloo in June of 1815, Napoleon surrendered to the British, who made a deliberate decision about where to put him that would define the remainder of his life. Rather than a European prison, which risked rescue attempts or renewed uprisings by his still considerable base of supporters, the British selected St Helena, a small volcanic island roughly 1,200 miles from the nearest coastline of Africa, one of the most isolated pieces of habitable land on the planet. Napoleon arrived there in October of 1815 and would never leave again. He was housed at Longwood House, a converted former farm building that British administrators had repurposed for his imprisonment. Contemporary accounts, including Napoleon's own complaints recorded by his companions, consistently describe the house as damp, poorly ventilated, and generally unhealthy, situated in a location exposed to persistent wind and moisture that made the interior chronically humid regardless of the weather outside. Rats were a constant, well-documented problem throughout the property, and several visitors specifically noted a persistent, unpleasant odor throughout the building that no amount of cleaning seemed able to fully eliminate. Napoleon himself complained repeatedly in letters and recorded conversations with his companions about the house's condition, at one point reportedly describing it as barely fit for habitation by any standard he would have expected for a person of his former stature, though his British captors were, by most accounts, largely unmoved by these complaints. Daily life at Longwood settled into a rigid, monotonous routine that Napoleon found increasingly stifling as the years passed. His movements around the island were tightly restricted by British military oversight, correspondence was censored, and visitors were limited and closely monitored, a set of restrictions that weighed on a man who had spent most of his adult life commanding armies and reshaping the political map of an entire continent. Napoleon reportedly filled much of his remaining time dictating memoirs and reflections on his own military campaigns to the small circle of companions who had chosen to share his exile, an effort at shaping how history would eventually remember him that stood in increasingly stark contrast to the physical decline, steadily overtaking him in the same rooms where he dictated those recollections. Several of his companions who shared his exile later wrote that the psychological toll of this confinement seemed, at times, to compound whatever physical illness was simultaneously working through his body, each making the other harder to bear. Napoleon's health, robust for most of his adult life despite the physical demands of decades of military campaigning, began a slow, unmistakable decline within the first few years of his confinement at Longwood. He complained increasingly of abdominal pain, nausea, and a persistent deep fatigue that left him spending more and more of each day confined to bed. His weight fluctuated dramatically, and visitors during his final years described him as a diminished, prematurely aged version of the vigorous commander who had once dominated European battlefields. Beyond the abdominal symptoms, several accounts from his final years describe additional complaints that, in hindsight, sit somewhat awkwardly alongside a purely gastrointestinal diagnosis: episodes of chills and shivering, swelling in his legs and ankles, and periods of unusual drowsiness alternating with restless, disturbed sleep. Individually, none of these symptoms pointed conclusively toward any single explanation available to 19th century medicine. Collectively, they would later strike some researchers as a genuinely broader pattern than a single stomach ailment could easily account for on its own. The doctors attending him, several of whom rotated through the assignment over the years, struggled to agree on exactly what was wrong, though most eventually settled on some variation of a digestive or stomach ailment. This diagnosis gained additional plausibility from Napoleon's own family history. His father had reportedly died of stomach cancer at a relatively young age, and hereditary stomach disease seemed, to the physicians attending him, like the most obvious explanation for a set of symptoms that otherwise defied easy categorization. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. The official autopsy, conducted by his personal physician along with several British medical witnesses, identified a substantial stomach ulcer, described in terms consistent with what modern medicine would likely classify as stomach cancer, and this was recorded as the definitive, uncontested cause of death for well over a century afterward. Napoleon himself, in the years before his death, had reportedly come to believe he was suffering from the same illness that killed his father, and specifically requested in his will that his body be examined afterward, partly to confirm or rule out that suspicion, a request that, unknowingly, would end up satisfying only part of a much larger, still unanswered question. Here's what nobody could have predicted at the time, that a piece of Napoleon himself, quite literally, had already been separately preserved in a form that would eventually allow a completely different kind of investigation entirely. Following a custom of the era similar to the one that would later preserve a lock of Beethoven's hair, several of Napoleon's companions and attendants cut and kept locks of his hair, both during his final illness and shortly after his death, treating them as personal keepsakes and mementos of a man whose historical significance was already, even in 1821, considered enormous. These locks passed down through multiple families and collections across the following century and a half, occasionally changing hands, occasionally forgotten in private collections, until several authenticated samples eventually became available to researchers interested in applying modern forensic techniques to a historical question, establishing which samples could genuinely be traced back to Napoleon himself, rather than to any of the various other historical figures whose hair circulated through similar collector networks over the decades, would itself become an important and occasionally contentious part of the ongoing research, since a result was only as trustworthy as the documented chain of ownership behind the specific sample being tested. In 1961, a Swedish dentist and amateur toxicologist named Sten Forsjöfud, who had developed a serious interest in the persistent rumors surrounding Napoleon's death, arranged for several authenticated hair samples to be tested using a technique called neutron activation analysis, a method capable of detecting extraordinarily small trace amounts of specific elements, including arsenic, with a level of precision entirely unavailable to 19th century medicine. Forsjöfud had originally trained in dentistry rather than toxicology, and his interest in the case began somewhat unusually, reportedly sparked by a chance historical reading of accounts describing Napoleon's final symptoms, which struck him as strikingly consistent with known arsenic poisoning rather than the officially recorded stomach illness. The results were striking. Arsenic levels in the tested hair measured significantly elevated compared to typical values. In some later analyses reported at roughly 100 times what would be considered a normal background level for the era. This finding reignited a controversy that had actually simmered quietly for decades among a small number of historians who had always found the official stomach cancer explanation somewhat unsatisfying given certain symptoms Napoleon experienced that didn't fit especially well with that particular diagnosis. Forsjöfud's toxicology results gave that lingering suspicion a genuinely scientific foundation for the first time, and launched him, along with several subsequent researchers, on a decades-long investigation into exactly how and why Napoleon might have absorbed such significant quantities of a known poison during his final years of confinement. The most dramatic version of the resulting theory proposed deliberate murder, specifically pointing toward Charles Tristan de Montholon, one of Napoleon's own attendants at Longwood House, who some researchers argued may have been secretly working on behalf of French royalist interests, hoping to permanently eliminate any possibility of a Bonapartist political revival. Montholon controlled access to Napoleon's wine supply during much of his confinement, and proponents of the murder theory constructed detailed timelines attempting to match specific episodes of Napoleon's worsening symptoms to particular occasions when Montholon would have had a clear opportunity to administer arsenic through food or drink. Some versions of this theory point to specific documented incidents, including a period where Napoleon and several of his household staff fell simultaneously and severely ill after sharing a bottle of wine. An episode proponents argue is difficult to explain through ordinary foodborne illness alone. This poisoning theory generated significant popular attention across subsequent decades, complete with published books making the case in considerable circumstantial detail, and it remains, even today, one of the more widely repeated explanations for Napoleon's death in popular historical accounts. Critics of the murder theory, however, have pointed out that circumstantial timelines built around a single suspect, however carefully constructed decades after the fact, remain fundamentally difficult to prove or disprove with the surviving historical evidence, and that Montholon's specific motive, loyalty to a royalist cause, he never definitively demonstrated any strong personal commitment to elsewhere in his documented life, remains largely speculative. But that wasn't the whole story. Researchers eventually pieced together, and a rather different, less deliberately sinister explanation gradually gained serious traction as well. Longwood House, as it turned out, had been decorated in part using a wallpaper featuring a strikingly vivid green pigment that had become enormously fashionable across Europe in the decades surrounding Napoleon's imprisonment. That specific pigment, commonly known as Scheele's green after the chemist who first synthesized it in the 1770s, achieved its remarkably vibrant color through a compound called copper arsenite, meaning the wallpaper itself contained substantial quantities of arsenic, bound directly into the very pigment covering the walls of the rooms where Napoleon spent the majority of his final years. Scheele's green and closely related arsenic-based green pigments that followed it became genuinely ubiquitous across late 18th and 19th century decorating, prized specifically for a brilliant, saturated shade of green that competing pigments of the era simply couldn't reliably reproduce. The pigment took its name from Carl Wilhelm Scheele, a Swedish chemist who first synthesized the compound in 1775 while investigating arsenic-based chemistry more broadly, apparently without any particular concern for its eventual decorative popularity or its toxic properties. Since the specific dangers of arsenic exposure through everyday household contact were not yet well understood by the chemistry of his era, it appeared not just in wallpaper, but in fabric dyes, paints, artificial flowers, candles, and even in some children's toys and articles of clothing, entirely legal and widely available for the better part of a century before its dangers became fully, publicly understood. The scale of its popularity is difficult to overstate. Historians estimate that by the mid-19th century, a very substantial share of wallpaper produced across Britain and much of Europe contained some arsenic-based green pigment, meaning millions of ordinary households, not merely the residence of a famous exiled emperor, were papered with walls containing the same basic toxic compound. Documented cases of illness specifically attributed to arsenical wallpaper multiplied across the following decades, particularly affecting children in nurseries decorated with the fashionable color, and by the 1860s and 70s, physicians and public commentators, including figures as prominent as the scientist Michael Faraday, had begun publicly raising concerns about the specific health risks of arsenic-based decorating pigments, concerns that eventually contributed to the pigment's gradual decline in popularity, though never through any single decisive regulatory ban across most of the affected countries. The mechanism connecting arsenic-laced wallpaper to actual chronic poisoning turns out to be genuinely fascinating and considerably more indirect than simply touching or absorbing the pigment through skin contact. In damp, poorly ventilated conditions, exactly the kind repeatedly described in contemporary accounts of Longwood House, certain species of mold can metabolize the arsenic compounds within the wallpaper's pigment and release the element as a toxic gas, sometimes referred to informally as Gossio's gas, after the Italian physician who first documented the mechanism scientifically at the very end of the 19th century. In other words, Napoleon may not have needed to eat or drink anything contaminated at all. He may simply have needed to breathe the air inside his own damp, badly ventilated rooms, day after day, for years. Gossio's original research, conducted decades after Napoleon's death, specifically investigated a pattern of mysterious illness and death among people, particularly children, sleeping in rooms decorated with arsenical wallpaper in consistently damp conditions, and he successfully demonstrated in laboratory settings that specific common household molds, when grown directly on arsenic-pigmented wallpaper samples, produced a distinctly garlic-smelling toxic gas capable of causing exactly the kind of chronic symptoms historically associated with these rooms. The compound was later chemically identified as trimethylarsine, and the underlying biological mechanism, once demonstrated, retroactively explained a huge number of previously mysterious illness clusters that had been reported anecdotally around arsenical wallpaper for decades before anyone understood the actual chemistry involved. Researchers investigating this environmental theory have since obtained samples of wallpaper matching, documented patterns actually used at Longwood House, and confirmed significant arsenic content consistent with Sheila's green formulations common to the era. In the 1980s, a chemist working from a preserved fragment of wallpaper believed to originate from Longwood House conducted a detailed chemical analysis and confirmed substantial arsenic concentrations within the pigment itself, a finding widely cited afterward as physical material evidence directly connecting the specific documented decorating choices at Napoleon's residence to the broader chemistry already known to be capable of causing exactly this kind of chronic environmental poisoning. Combined with the persistent dampness independently documented in contemporary accounts of the house, the conditions for at least some degree of chronic environmental arsenic exposure appear to have been genuinely present throughout Napoleon's confinement, entirely independent of whether anyone around him was also deliberately adding arsenic to his food. Not every researcher studying this question has landed on a poisoning explanation at all, deliberate or environmental. A significant complicating factor is that arsenic exposure was, by the standards of any modern comparison, remarkably common throughout the 19th century generally, showing up in medicines, cosmetics, food dyes, and countless household products well beyond wallpaper specifically. Some skeptical historians and toxicologists have argued that elevated arsenic levels in a hair sample from this particular era don't, by themselves, prove anything unusual happened to Napoleon specifically, since broadly similar elevated readings might plausibly turn up in hair samples from a great many ordinary people living through the same period. Exposed to the same common environmental sources everyone else of that era encountered constantly. A study published in the early 2000s, comparing Napoleon's hair arsenic levels against samples taken from other individuals of the same broad historical period, including some entirely unconnected to Longwood House or St Helena, reportedly found comparably elevated readings across several of the comparison samples as well. Results some researchers have cited as evidence that Napoleon's specific readings, while genuinely high by modern standards, may not have actually been unusual for a person of his era and social class at all, complicating any simple conclusion that his particular exposure represented something exceptional rather than simply typical background contamination of the age he happened to live in. This remains a genuinely unresolved historical debate rather than a settled conclusion. The competing explanations, murder, environmental accident, or simply unremarkable background exposure typical of the era, each have serious researchers arguing in their favor, and no single piece of evidence uncovered so far has been sufficient to definitively rule out the other two possibilities. What virtually everyone studying the question agrees on is that the original 1821 stomach cancer diagnosis, treated as settled fact for well over a century, was almost certainly, at minimum, an incomplete account of what was actually happening inside Napoleon's body during those final years on St Helena. Here's the crazy part. Modern medical historians re-examining the original 1821 autopsy notes, applying contemporary diagnostic understanding to descriptions written nearly 2 centuries earlier, have suggested that at least some of the reported stomach findings could plausibly be explained by either genuine cancer or by the kind of chronic gastrointestinal irritation long-term arsenic exposure is independently known to cause, meaning the two competing explanations that once seemed to rule each other out may, in a strange way, have both been at least partially correct all along, each contributing separately to the same slow decline. What lingers more than the specific unresolved question of murder versus accident is how completely invisible the true situation was to everyone actually present at the time. Napoleon's own physicians, working with the very best medical understanding available to them, examined him repeatedly across 6 years of declining health and never once suspected that the walls surrounding his sickbed might themselves be part of the problem. The wallpaper was, after all, simply fashionable, exactly the kind of tasteful, expensive decorating choice a household of any real status across Europe might reasonably have selected, the last thing anyone in 1815 would have thought to treat with suspicion. It is worth sitting, briefly, with just how strange it is that the same specific pigment, implicated in one of history's most famous unsolved medical mysteries, was, at the very same time, quietly decorating the nurseries, drawing rooms, and dining halls of ordinary families across an entire continent, almost none of whom would ever have their own exposure investigated by anyone at all. Napoleon's case survives as a genuine historical puzzle, specifically because he was famous enough that people kept preserved locks of his hair, famous enough that researchers a century and a half later thought the question worth pursuing with real scientific rigor. The overwhelming majority of people who may have quietly suffered the same slow, invisible exposure inside their own homes left no comparable trace at all, their suffering simply absorbed into the ordinary, unremarked upon background of 19th century domestic life. Stand back in that small, damp house on St Helena one more time, watching a man once powerful enough to redraw the map of an entire continent slowly weaken inside four walls, covered in a color everyone around him considered simply beautiful. The stomach cancer diagnosis his own doctors wrote down was, by most modern accounts, not entirely wrong. Family history and documented symptoms both suggest genuine digestive illness was very likely present as well. But it was very probably not the complete picture, and it would take a hair sample, a laboratory technique that wouldn't exist for another century and a half, and a slow, patient reconstruction of exactly what covered the walls of a small house on a remote island to even begin asking the right question. The final irony, of course, is that nobody involved needed to be a villain for this to happen at all. No conspiracy is strictly required for a decorating trend, a persistently damp climate, and a species of ordinary household mold to combine into a genuine, if entirely accidental, chemical hazard. Whether or not Montholon or anyone else at Longwood House deliberately hastened Napoleon's decline remains, and will likely remain, permanently unresolved. What the wallpaper alone was quietly capable of doing, given enough time, enough dampness, and enough exposure, required no human intention whatsoever. Subscribe, and next time you compliment someone's taste in home decor, consider asking gently exactly what's actually in the paint.